This is one of my favorite quotes ever, but it's kind of a tough pill to swallow, right? After all, isn't fear supposed to protect you from danger? Well, when I was a biology major in school, one of the few things I remember is that you actually feel fear starting from your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that senses external danger. And it kind of triggers your nervous system to get into this fight or flight mode. You've probably heard of it. Basically, it's a warning system against anything that your body might perceive as a potential harm. And the key here is potential harm, because here's the thing. If you want something you've never had, the process of getting that thing is very unknown to you. And maybe you realize by this point in your life, but us humans really fear the unknown because it's a lot easier for our brain to just assume there's danger, just in case it exists, whether it actually does or not. So even though I knew all this and I knew that danger, that possibility of danger kind of just existed in my own head, deciding to quit my stable job to try and start a business and of course find more freedom in my life was still really, really scary. And if you're thinking of doing the same thing, then you probably know kind of how scary it feels. But even if we recognize this fear, what do we do about it? How do we get to the other side of this fear, do what it takes to make all of our dreams come true? Well, not you exactly, but I'm willing to bet that we have some of the same very common fears that everyone has when they're about to quit their job. So today, I want to share all the fears I had, how I was able to overcome them, and just pull the trigger on starting the next chapter of my life. And hopefully by hearing this, it might help you overcome them as well. All right, let's go. So the first big fear I had, which I'm sure almost everyone probably thinks about when they're first quitting their job, is what if I run out of money? It's totally valid and honestly one of the biggest things we do have to think about. The most obvious answer to this is don't quit. Don't quit your job until you know that you can make money doing something else, which for most people means creating a side hustle to work on alongside your 9 to 5 until you're confident enough to switch all your focus to that side hustle, but full time. And I definitely recommend doing this if you can. But if you're impatient like me or just seriously need a break from your job, then you'll probably have to spend a bit more time planning these kinds of things out. And for most people, and definitely for me, having a really solid plan really does make it easier to understand the fear and begin to overcome it. Since you've done the due diligence, right? You know the risks, the benefits, and the timeline of your next chapter. So what needs to be on this plan? And for me, I want to make sure I knew 4 things. Number 1 is the total cash you're willing to burn. Number 2 is your estimated monthly living expenses. So just what do you need to spend to stay alive? Number 3, your estimated monthly business expenses. And number 4, a list of backup options in case all your cash gets burned. Okay, so let's talk about total cash first. Ideally, this would be like your savings or your investments that you're willing to liquidate. And it's really best to think about your worst case scenario here, as in how much are you willing to just completely lose? Let me be clear that this isn't financial advice, but just info about how I personally went planning this runway out for myself. For me, I was willing to invest a lot of my savings and investments because in my mind, even if I end up losing all this money, what I would gain back in experience and learnings would be well worth it. So how much you invest is totally up to you. For number 2, the estimated living expenses, I basically calculate everything that you pay consistently on a monthly basis. And then for those variable expenses that kind of change between month to month, I just do my best to create monthly averages for them. For number 3, estimating business expenses, this will usually be pretty unclear at the start, and that's totally fine. Just having a general idea of how much you're willing to spend for your business. So just do your best to have an educated guess based on what kind of business that you're trying to start. For example, an online business could have potentially low startup costs, but maybe you'll have to spend a bit more on marketing. So that's just for you to think about. It's totally okay if this changes over time, but the important thing is just to have a general rough number at the very start. And cool, so basically once you have number 1, 2, and 3, you can begin to calculate your total runway time. So that's the total amount of time you have before you run out of money and have to go into your backup options. So to get this total runway time, you basically take number 2 and 3, which is your living expenses, your monthly living expenses, and your monthly business expenses, and add those expenses up to get the total expense. And then just take your total cash, which is number 1, and then divide that by your total monthly expenses. Personally, I gave myself a 2-year runway to make sure that I had an ample amount of time before needing to go back to my backup options. So maybe after calculating all this, you feel like your runway time could be a bit longer. You could always figure out ways to decrease your monthly living expenses by doing things like moving to a cheaper place with lower rent, or maybe cutting down on monthly subscriptions you don't need anymore. Or you can even increase the total cash you're willing to burn by just working longer and saving up a bit more before you take the plunge. And lastly, for number 4, which is your list of backup options, I would try and think of at least 3 different backup options just in case, in the worst case scenario, your business doesn't take off. For me, I always felt that even if I run out all the cash that I set aside to burn, one of my backup options is I could always try and find another job again to save up more money again, learn some new skills, and just try again later. And if you don't want to do this, in many states in the US, there's a lot of different aid you can get for people with low to no income, like groceries and health insurance. And even moving back in with your parents or other friends to really decrease your living expenses is another option you could take. And I totally get that not everyone has the same type of backup options that other people do. But in general, most people do have options. And yeah, maybe you won't be living your ideal comfy life if you end up having to go with your backup options. But the important thing is that it will allow you to keep going and learning for as long as it takes. So just knowing this fact for me really helped me realize that money at the end of the day is just a tool, something we can use to trade for other things of value. And if I could trade in that value for something that will help me learn and grow and build to create that freedom that I've always wanted, then that money would be well spent. And I get it right eventually. The second big fear I had was pretty much, what if I do this and I lose all confidence? And what if I realize that I'm just really bad at entrepreneurship? If I've never done it before, how will I know it's worth trying? But after all these negative thoughts, something I realized is that you have to expect to be bad at the start. I talked about this in a previous video, but there's this weird societal pressure that we all feel because all we see on social media is that highlight reel of everyone living their best lives and just achieving success all the time. And somehow it just got normalized that you should just be really good at things all the time. And it really made it clear that my big fear in losing confidence was I couldn't live up to seeing the same success as all these people you see online. But you know what? All the successes that you see online, those are the outliers and not actually the majority. And in fact, most of us are just average people growing at an average pace, learning slowly over time. And I think that's completely fine. Why should I expect to hit that success faster than other people if I've never had entrepreneurship experience before? Plus, I've been really bad at things before, and I've learned to get good at those things over time. And I'm willing to bet you have too. Entrepreneurship is just a skill at the end of the day. And like all skills, you can learn to be great at them with just enough practice and dedication. Which leads to the last fear I had. What if all this time I spent practicing and investing doesn't actually pay off? And being an entrepreneur just isn't as great as I thought it would be? Wouldn't this have just been all a huge waste of time? And I realized, no, hardly. In fact, it's the total opposite. How can we ever know that something is right for us unless we've really just tried ourselves? And if you've ever even remotely thought that being that entrepreneur could be a really cool life, to be your own boss, to make your own rules, be in charge of your own destiny, are you really willing to reach the end without ever knowing what could have been? Ask anyone that knows me and they will probably say that I'm a pretty impatient person that doesn't like wasting time. I'm definitely working on it, but the only thing I can't stand more than wasting time is living with regret. If you've ever imagined yourself as an entrepreneur more than once, and at any point just given it serious thought, and I highly encourage you to try it out, even if it takes some time and money. At the end of the day, you'll either come out a successful entrepreneur or a much more experienced human with learnings and stories to tell. Stuff that's pretty priceless in the grand scheme of things. And trust me, I get that it's scary. After all, it was one of my biggest 3 fears too. But at the same time, and after everything I've learned in my life so far, I've never regretted trying something new and interesting. And if you know what I mean, then you'll also know that on the other side of fear is everything you've ever wanted. So I'm sure everyone's different, but at least for me, these are my 3 biggest fears and how I overcame them. If you're still a little scared or want to learn more, something else that also helped me get over these fears was reading these 3 books. I talked about them in a previous video about how they really helped prepare me for becoming a first-time solopreneur. So I highly recommend taking a look at that video. If you thought that this video was helpful, then you'll definitely think that this one is too. All right, thanks for sticking until the end and see you soon.